Hi, fifth graders. Welcome back. Today we're reviewing Unit 3 content on the 13 American colonies. Our aim today is to describe the colonial groups and the ways that the American colonists impact the Native Americans. So first, let's talk about why are these countries colonizing? So we know that Europe had a scarcity of farmland and raw materials like timber and iron ore. And we know that the American colonies had a large supply of these things. So, for example, the demand for these raw materials was really high in Europe. Thus, the European countries are creating colonies in America to produce enough supply of these raw materials to meet their demand. Because trade of these materials was so important, many colonies were located along waterways to serve as ports for trade ships. So we see here in Europe, this is where they need more of these raw materials. So they create colonies here in the Americas. We know that there were many major cities located along rivers and bays, and that was so they could trade along this Atlantic Ocean to Europe. The raw materials like lumber or timber would come from the colonies. They would be processed in the factories in Europe and then sold back to the colonies as finished goods. So instead of just wood, they would turn the wood into things like tables and chairs and send them back as finished goods. So why would individual people colonize? So there were many personal reasons why a single person would say, hey, I'm going to pack up my whole life here in Europe and travel this dangerous boat ride over to the Americas and start a whole new life there. Some people were just looking for economic opportunities. When we hear economic opportunities, we're thinking money. They thought that they could make money managing farms and raw material mines. They also felt that they could make money trading furs. Other people came to the New World looking for religious freedom. Great Britain required all of its people to practice in the Church of England, so separatists came to America to practice their own religion. We still have religious freedom today in America, and that's because our founding fathers did not want to repeat the mistakes of Great Britain. So people came from England to the 13 American colonies for economic reasons and for religious reasons to find religious freedom. So that's Great Britain. Let's talk a little bit about why France is coming to the New World, and that's going to be because of the fur trade. Fur clothing was very popular in Europe, but there was also a scarcity of fur in Europe. Thus, the fur trapping colonies were very popular in the New World. The French often went to Canada to trap the animals for pelts, and then they would trade with natives for even more pelts. Eventually, a man named Samuel de Champlain established the first permanent French settlement in Quebec. So the French are up here in kind of like Canada. Champlain is going to create the first French colony up over here, and he's doing it so that he could have fur trades. We saw that the French don't just trap the fur themselves, but they also trade with the natives. So the French are here for fur. The British, however, are more concerned with farming than with trapping. So they do some fur trading, they just don't do as much as the French. The British are here for those 13 American colonies. The French are here in Canada for fur trading. So here's an example of an animal that they would trap for their fur, a beaver, and then they would use it to make clothing for people. Here is a map showing us the colonies that were controlled by France. That's here in this yellow. The British, those are those 13 American colonies, and the Spanish colonies. We know that the 13 American colonies eventually become the United States of America after they fight the American Revolution. And all of these countries are coming in from Europe. So a little bit more about the fur trade. Cooperation with Native Americans was essential for the fur trade. Often, the natives did a lot of trapping, and the French would simply purchase the furs from them. Now, this leads to some conflict between the native tribes because the animals become scarce over time. So they hunt and trap so many of these animals that many of them die and their ecosystems are disrupted. And when that happens, natives begin fighting with each other to control land or be part of the land. The French also had a better relationship with the natives, and that's because they relied on them for the fur. The French needed the natives to capture the fur for them, and so the natives, they were more likely to be nice and respect the natives. Here's an image of a Native American, and we see that they've captured this pelt and they're giving it to the French. They're trading for the pelts. Now we're going to focus mostly on the 13 American colonies. So those are those British created colonies that become the United States of America. So there were a couple of really important colonies in those 13 American colonies. And the first was Roanoke. That was the first attempt at a British colony. They had very bad and violent relationships with the Native Americans, and they mostly only grew their food to survive. This was a little colony and it did not make it. Remember, this is the one that mysteriously disappears. So this is the first attempt. Jamestown is the first successful British colony. And Jamestown had a different history. Early on, they actually had really friendly relations with the Native Americans. They needed them for food, but over time, that relationship soured and it turned violent. Jamestown Colony first was just searching for gold. They actually didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. Remember, they had that starving time. But then over time, they began growing tobacco as a cash crop. The Jamestown Colony did survive. This was the first successful British colony. Both of these colonies were American, and they both had bad relationships with the natives. So we're seeing some similarities here. Here's an image from Roanoke. It's showing that they're thinking the people may have been killed or joined the Croatan native tribe. And here's the Jamestown settlement. Another colony was the Plymouth Colony. This was a colony created by pilgrims. Pilgrim is just a word that you use to describe someone who goes on a religious journey. The pilgrims who came to America were separatists looking for religious freedom. Someone who's a separatist wants to leave the Church of England entirely. So these pilgrims do not want to be part of the Church of England, but they're not allowed to practice another religion in England. So they ask to come to America so they can practice whatever religion they want. The Plymouth colony is different than a lot of the other British colonies because they actually create peaceful relationships with the Native Americans. And the Native Americans help them survive the cold winters by teaching them how to farm and giving them food so they don't starve to death. The Treaty of Massasoit was a treaty that was signed between the Pilgrims and the natives. It was the first peace treaty that's been signed between Native Americans and Europeans. In this treaty, both sides agreed not to hurt the other, and they agreed to protect the other. This treaty is credited with helping the Pilgrims survive. They were not prepared to survive otherwise. They likely would have starved to death in the winter if it had not been for this peace treaty. In return, the Pilgrims accidentally spread diseases to the natives, and 2/3 of their population ended up dying. So this was a very positive and peaceful relationship between the two groups. But unfortunately, just because the British had those European diseases they were immune to, they accidentally spread it to the natives. The Plymouth colony was over here in the New England colonies. And remember, the farther up we go, the colder it is. The farther down you go, the hotter it is. Here's a picture from the first Thanksgiving. Again, the natives are given credit for helping the Pilgrims survive their first couple of winters. And a little bit more about the Plymouth colony. In the Plymouth colony, the colonists wrote the Mayflower Compact. Remember, they wrote it on the boat before they even landed in the colony. And in this, they all agreed to a form of self-government where they would rule themselves And in this self government, they established a democracy. And that's where people vote on decisions. So they wanted to give their people a say in government.